Okay, so welcome everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning. Pleasure to be learning together again as part of Fall Zman here at Drisha. This is the last class in the session on death, love, and life in the thought of Franz Rosenzweig with Rabbi Zachary Truboff. And I think everyone here has already been to the classes, so I think we could just jump right in. So I'll turn this to you, Rabbi Truboff.
Thank you so much, Evie. We are at our final class. We are at the end, but as we know, what is the end except a new beginning, and that's something that Rosenzweig I think is particularly attuned to. What I'd like to do is use this final session as an opportunity to sort of touch upon various themes that we've looked at so far, but also to try to take it a step further. Which is for Rosenzweig the question of, once we start raising these ideas, once we start trying to look at the world in a different way, the way that he is trying to, open us up to, what does it then mean to actually live them? What does it actually mean to live life, carrying these ideas, this awareness in one's mind? And that's a very, very important question for Rosenzweig, though he is a philosopher and a philosopher of what some might consider to be, some of the most abstract philosophy that there is. One of the things that's very striking about Franz Rosenzweig is the extent to which his thought is only meaningful if it's able to be lived as meaningful, if it's real and meaningful in your life. He actually says this in one of his later essays, that if you want to determine the effectiveness, the efficacy, the truth of the Star of Redemption, of his thought, right? Like the way that you prove it is not by trying to judge the merit of the logical arguments that he makes, but by trying to live it. And personally, as a rabbi, there's something that I find to be quite profound about that. Rosenzweig, for the most part, is studied in academia, right, by professors. And much of the way that academia looks at the thought of Rosenzweig is, again, to try to describe, debate, analyze, again, the structural arguments that he makes, the theoretical arguments that he makes. What they're not interested in doing, because academia can't do this, is try to live it, not just on an abstract sort of pseudo-objective level, but as a lived reality, as lived experience. So that's what I want to turn us to, and part of the way we'll do that is by looking at events in Rosenzweig's own life and how they reflect his thought, and in many ways the test of his thoughts, right? The test of its meaning, the test of the very truth that he's trying to point us towards. So, Death, Love, and Life in the Thought of Franz Rosenzweig. This final session is titled Into Life, which are the two words that end the Star of Redemption, right? The Star of Redemption begins with basically death, right? The confrontation with death. And it ends with the charge, the imperative, the mitzvah, you might say, to enter back into life. As I was saying before, for Rosenzweig, the test of the truth of his teachings is not something that we can determine by just reading his words and thinking about them, right? Contemplating them, right? Trying to make sense of them in our heads. One of the fundamental points that he makes is that truth is not something that we prove, right? Like, again, like I said, with logical arguments or anything like that. Truth is something that is verified, particularly that is verified within lived experience. And that's what he says in his essay, The New Thinking, one of his later essays that tries to encapsulate a lot of his thought. He says, thus truth ceases to be what is true and becomes that which has to be verified as true, right? Truth isn't something that we're just taught as true and that's the end of it, right? We may be taught that things are true, but the measure of that truth, the test of that truth, is whether or not in our own life we can verify it as true, right? Many things that we consider to be truths, we take on faith. We believe them to be true because people tell us that they're true. People who we trust tell us that they're true. People who are experts tell us that they are true. We don't really understand if they're true or not. Like, I don't understand how a microwave works. I don't understand how my laptop or my cell phone works, right? But people know, and they say there's a truth there, and I just sort of assume they're correct, right? Rosenzweig is asking us not to take his thoughts on faith ultimately, but that rather, the test is whether or not we can live it. He says the hopelessly static truths, like those of mathematics, which were made into the point of departure by the old epistemology, which means philosophy before him, without ever getting beyond this point of departure, are conceived from this perspective as the lower limiting case. His point is here, normally we think about truth, particularly in philosophy, we think about it in mathematical terms, right? Like I keep saying, truths are that which can be proven. 1 + 1 = 2. 2 + 2 = 4. X = Y + B, right? Truth is something that can be proven. It can be proven objectively, as he says here, statically. It's unchanging. 1 + 1 always equals 2, now and forever. Rosenzweig's point is that those truths are true, but they are the lowest levels of truth, right? That which we might think of as objective truth, mathematical truth, right? They are the lowest levels of truth, what he calls the limiting case. As rest is conceived as the limiting case of motion, right? We define motion in opposition to rest, right? So we need rest to be able to define motion, but if you really want to understand motion, rest is really not helpful, right? Like you actually need to see motion. And that's his point here. If you want to understand the kind of truths he's getting at, mathematical proofs are mostly going to tell you what it is not. He says, well, the higher and highest truths are only capable of being grasped as truths from this perspective, instead of having to be relabeled as fictions, postulates, and needs, right? That again, the kind of truths he's getting at are not 1 + 1 = 2, 2 × 2 = 4, right? They are a different kind of truths. From those most unimportant truths of the type 2 × 2 = 4, as I've been saying, they're not, it's truth, but they're not like important truths on which people easily agree. That's part of what makes them maybe less important, is that people can pretty much agree that 2 + 2 = 4. Right? That's not a hard truth in a sense. It's not a truth that is subject to a ton of debate, right? With no other expense than a little bit of brain power, right? You can learn 2 + 2 × 2 = 4 in first or second grade, right? You can grasp that, you can figure it out. It's not a hard truth. For the multiplication table, a little less. For relativity theory, a little more, right? Even relativity theory, Einstein's great breakthrough, right? It still is proved objectively. If you take the time and you're careful, right, you can work through and understand the proofs that are necessary to explain the theory. But again, Rosenzweig's point is the kind of truths that we're getting at, what we might call religious truths, existential truths, right? These are something beyond truths that can be determined from the inside of a classroom. He says, the way leads over those truths for which a man is willing to pay. To those he cannot verify in any other way than with the sacrifice of his life, right? 2 × 2 = 4 is truth. It is true, but most of us are not willing to die for it, which means the level of truth of the 2 × 2 = 4 represents, in the grand scheme of things, is not of terribly great importance, right? The kind of truths that matter to us are the kind of truths that we stake our life on, right? The kind of truths that we're willing to give up our lives for, or another way to think about it, are the kind of truths that make life worth living, right? Those are the truths that we're trying to get at here in Rosenzweig's thought, the truths that we're willing to give our life for, and finally to those whose truth can be verified only by risking the life of all generations, right? There are some truths that the true test of them only comes if you're willing to give up everything, not just yourself, but everything now and forever. And for Rosenzweig, the point is that truth with a capital T are those kinds of truths. And these are the kinds of truths that you can only know in life, right? You can't know them from a classroom. You can't know them from reading a book, right? You can't know them because somebody walked you through the details of the proofs. They are just, I mean, those can set you up for it, right? But ultimately, the verification of the truth, of that truth that you learn from a book, that you hear in a classroom, that you learn from a teacher, right? It only can be verified, can be shown to be true in life itself. And then that's why I really want to take this last session to turning towards Rosenzweig's own life, to try to show the way the truths that we have been trying to explore manifest in his own experience. In many ways, are derived from that experience. And I would argue to a certain extent their universality of the truths that Rosenzweig is getting at are universal because they derive from human experience that is his own, but also can be found in all of ours as well. So to get at this, what I'm going to do here is take a letter that Rosenzweig wrote to his university professor, particularly his what they call Doktorvater, right? He is the advisor for his dissertation. In it, Rosenzweig offers a biographical reflection on much of his life. He writes this in 1920. The great transformation in his life occurs 7 years earlier in 1913, where he has a crisis that almost leads him to convert to Christianity, but he decides to remain a Jew. At that time, he had completed already in 1913 his dissertation with Friedrich Meinecke, who the letter is being written to. But what happens with Rosenzweig, after he completes the dissertation, after he goes through the crisis, after he decides to remain a Jew, is that he never goes back to academia. And Friedrich Meinecke, his advisor, at a certain point actually comes to Rosenzweig and offers him a university teaching position of some kind, which is highly unusual for a Jew to be able to have, right? In Germany in the early 20th century, there were very few academic positions of any kind for Jews. So the very fact that his teacher or his advisor was willing to give him one is a big deal. And Rosenzweig effectively turns him down. That from this moment of his own personal transformation in his life, right, he never goes back to academia. And that's very important, as we're going to see why that is. Where he does go after the war, after writing the Star of Redemption, is he helps found and run the Lehrhaus, which is a center for adult learning in Frankfurt, which brings together really Jews of all different backgrounds, what we might say conservative Orthodox Reform, to learn Torah together, which made it a very unusual and radical institution of its day. And not only was it unique in that all Jews of all different backgrounds came there to study, but the teachers who taught there are some of the greatest intellectuals of the last few centuries. So Martin Buber, Franz Rosenzweig, Gershom Scholem, Shai Agnon, Bertha Pappenheim. There's a whole long list of some of the greatest, Jewish thinkers who actually taught there as well. Rosenzweig runs it for a couple of years before he's diagnosed with ALS. And then from then on, basically, the disease is progressive. He becomes paralyzed within a couple of years and ultimately dies in, I think, 1929. This particular reflection, 1920, is before his disease, right? Before he's had the diagnosis, really. And he's reflecting on his decision not to go back to academia. And what I want to try to do in his description of his own life is to try to pick out the themes that we've been seeing, right? Our first session was about death, the confrontation with death, and how the confrontation with death leads to a collapse of the structures of meaning that exist in our life, those structures of meaning that we think grant us truth with a capital T, that help us feel that the world is a safe place, a certain place, that we haven't figured out, right? That if we just can follow these truths, everything will make sense for us, right? These ideological worldviews that promise, good, bad, redemption, that even if we die, we're being saved in some way, right? There's always a moment, potentially at least, where those kinds of worldviews, those kinds of systems can collapse. Often the confrontation of death is one of them. That was our first session. The second session, we looked at the idea that the human being has these dual dimensions to who they are, right? The human being is both personality and self, right? The personality is the aspect of us in which can be described, the list of attributes that define who we are. The self is the part of us that is created in the image of God, which exceeds all of those categories and attributes through which the world tries to define us and we try to define the world. That there's always a way in which human beings don't fit in the box, that we can kind of say no to anything. And when we are put in the box and we think that's where we belong, it's not always such a good experience for us. It's rather destructive often. The session after that, we touched upon the idea of redemption, of revelation, right? That there are moments in which God calls to us and everything changed. There are moments in which God calls to us and we fall in love and we find ourselves committing ourselves to that call and responding, and not just responding in the moment, but responding in a sense forever. In the session after that, we learned about redemption, how the moment of revelation, it changes our whole perspective on the world. It gives us now a grounding of truth that then founds our life going forward. And much of what we do in the wake of revelation is to try to build on that experience. But part of what revelation does is it enables us to look at the other in a different kind of way. It enables ourselves to be open to the other in a way that we haven't potentially experienced them before, to love them, to feel responsible to them, and whatever it might mean in that particular moment. And that is where we left off last time. And I want to show you how those themes now manifest in Rosenzweig's own life. So in his letter to his advisor, he starts by noting, in 1913, something happened to me for which collapse is the only fitting name. Right? Now, what's interesting, as I said before, that the experience with death often causes our structures of meaning to collapse. What happened in 1913 for Rosenzweig was not exactly the confrontation with death, though that was part of it to a certain extent. He has this conversation, very intense, difficult conversation with Eugene Rosenstock. They're both, essentially, Jewish academics, or I shouldn't say that they're both are. Rosenstock had been Jewish, converted to Christianity. And in the midst of this very intense, heated conversation, basically Rosenstock challenges Rosenzweig, like, why is it you're still a Jew? There's no reason for you to still be a Jew. And he challenges Rosenzweig to also grasp that Judaism doesn't really mean anything to him, even though he's had this tradition, this name, being a Jew, right? Like, he doesn't really understand what it means. He doesn't really know where it's supposed to take him. And Christianity is presented to Rosenzweig as a way of life that has meaning and purpose in the world. And that conversation fundamentally, I would say, shattered Rosenzweig's world. And when I say that there's death there, one of the things that Rosenzweig actually does is contemplate committing suicide after this conversation, right? This moment is such a collapse for him. It feels like his whole world is coming undone. Now, I'm not sure any of us have ever had that experience in which a conversation shattered our world, but we probably have had conversations that left us shaken, right? Left us, very shaken, that however we had imagined the world, whatever structures of meaning we thought help us make the world make sense, we have a conversation with somebody we don't necessarily expect, about things we don't necessarily expect, and suddenly we realize the way we've been looking at the world starts to have all sorts of cracks in it. And maybe, in fact, it starts to start crumbling down. And that was certainly the case for Rosenzweig, right? So just to point out, he has a moment in his life in which there's a confrontation with something that challenges his whole worldview, his whole perspective in a way that makes him realize how hollow and empty it is. Death does that, but in this case, sometimes a conversation can do that too. He says, suddenly found myself on a heap of wreckage, or rather, I realized that the road I was then pursuing was flanked by unrealities, right? He's suddenly realizing, again, these structures, these things he had been holding to, they're not that real. They don't really make sense, right? And again, he's an academic. He wants to be a professor. Perhaps he's thinking, in part, the only way I can be a professor is if I convert to Christianity. Suddenly he's realizing, like, what am I doing? Like, where is this all going? He says, yet this was the very road defined for me by my talent and my talent alone. I began to sense how meaningless such a subjection to the rule of one's talent was, and what abject servitude of the self it involved. So I want to translate here for a moment, argue that when Rosenzweig is speaking about his talent, right, versus the self, that he is, to a certain extent, describing what I was mentioning before about how human beings are sort of split personalities between personality and self, right? The personality are what Rosenzweig is describing here as his talents, right? The personality is the way the world views us, right? It's the labels, the attributes, the descriptions the world gives to us. The world says to me, you are a man. You are 5'11", right? You grew up here. You're good at this. You're bad at this, right? Like, this is what you can do that can bring value to the world, right? That is what Rosenzweig is describing as his talents, right? But they are, to a certain extent, something that is determined from what is outside of us, right? And the world is essentially saying to us, this is who you are. This is what you should do. And Rosenzweig is noting that experience of being put in the box is very much one of slavery, abject servitude, right? Who you are, there's something about who you are that gets suffocated in that process. He says, I felt a horror of myself, quite similar to the horror of Siegfried Kahler felt in my company when we were both studying in Freiburg. I remember how sinister my insatiable hunger for forms, a hunger without goal or meaning, driven on solely by its own momentum, that appeared to him. What Rosenzweig is describing is that in this moment of collapse, he's looking at himself in a different kind of way. He's looking at himself as an academic, right? And what do academics do? Like, what's the whole role of being an academic? Is it's your job to digest knowledge. It's your job to produce knowledge. It's your job to have theories and then take information, and it's your job to use those theories and chop up and digest and regurgitate that information through those theories, right? And part of what academia requires, and it's certainly true now, and it was certainly true then, is this insatiable desire to sort of like take information in and obsessively produce it, right? The academic's job is to do one thing, right? Publish or perish, right? Like, you got to take in the information to do it, and you got to be able to spit it back out again. And it's your job to put everything in the proper box. And there's a certain obsessiveness to this, right? Academic has to just keep producing, taking in more and more, producing more and more. And Rosenzweig is looking at his life up until this point, and he's almost looking at himself, as you might say, in an uncanny way. He looks at himself almost like from the outside, and what he sees is not so great, right? That experience of looking in the mirror and feeling like the image that looking back at you is not really you, right? Like, and maybe even being disturbed by the image that you see. You know it's you, but it doesn't quite feel like you. And that's what Rosenzweig is coming to, the realization that he's coming to as he looks at where his life has been leading up to this moment, right? That's what an existential collapse can do. It can force you to look at everything differently, and that is not always a very positive experience. He's basically saying, when I look at myself, I used to be like a zombie or a vampire, right? Like, just feed me, right? So I can spit out what I need to spit out, right? And that's not a human existence. But that existence that he is describing is one that was a result of, again, sort of living within a certain system, having a certain system or way of being imposed upon him, and feeling like it is his job to sort of feed the beast, right? Like, and again, if we want to make a contemporary parallel to this, right, our world is filled with these ideological worldviews, especially political worldviews. Like right now, right, like, there are political worldviews that will be able to say, this is good, this is evil, these are the good guys, these are the bad guys, it's your job to do this, it's your job to fight against that, right? And the more that you sort of buy into an ideological worldview that suddenly makes your world total, enables your world to make total sense to you, right, the more it's your job to sort of feed the worldview, right, to give it what it wants, right, and you as a cog in that wheel to serve it. And there's something truly dehumanizing about that Rosenzweig is noting. Even when people who are sort of in the midst of committing themselves to sort of an ideological worldview that's supposed to be about good and evil and fighting for life and all of that and doing the good things, being, one of the good guys, right side of history, he's also noticing that if you kind of step outside yourself and look at it, you can see how, twisted it is, how much it doesn't actually come to serve life, but serve its own ideological purposes in a way that, as I keep saying, is dehumanizing, right? The self is suffocated, right? The self, the part of us that doesn't fit in a box, because ideological worldviews are all about boxes, finds itself having the life sucked out of it. He says, amidst the shreds of my talents, I began to search for myself, right? There's a piece of us that always exceeds the categories through which the way the world tells us that it's supposed to make sense, right? I'm looking for myself. It was then one can speak. Oops. 1 second. It was then one can speak of such matters in metaphors only, that I descended into the vaults of my being, to place whither talents could not follow me, that I approached the ancient treasure chest whose existence I had never wholly forgotten. Rosenzweig is saying in the midst of this collapse, he goes one place. He goes within himself, right? That's where he goes, right? That the truth is ultimately on some level inside, but we're going to see it's actually a little bit more complicated than that. This is not a story of, he descends within himself and he finds out who he truly is, right? The true Rosenzweig, the true Franz was buried inside. He just had to discover it, right? And that is the unique, person that he is was always really there. That's not exactly what's going on here, but he does have to go inside himself to even begin to get at what, at the truth here. He says, I descended, he descends into himself, and he approaches the ancient treasure chest whose existence he had never wholly forgotten. There's something inside of him of value. That's what a treasure chest has. It's buried, it's deep, it's hidden. But when you reveal it, there's something very valuable there. He says, my hands dug in and turned over layer after layer, hoping to reach the bottom of the chest. They never did, right? This chest, which is, again, holding precious things, there's a sense that there's like no limit to the precious items that are there. Then I climbed back again to the upper stories and spread out before me what treasures I had found. They did not fade in the sheer light of day. These indeed were my own treasures, my most personal possessions, things inherited, not borrowed, right? Part of what makes these possessions unique is that they are not things that the world forces on him. They are things that have always been there for him, right? You inherit things from the people who came before you, right? When you're born into this world, we inherit all sorts of things, biologically, socially, familially, right? They are part of who we are, whether we like it or not. They are inside of us, but they are also that which exceeds us, right? Because they didn't come originally from us, but they are still, you can't separate them from us either. He says, by owning them and ruling over them, I had gained something entirely new, namely the right to live and even to have talents. For now, it was I who had the talents, not the they who had me. The one thing I wish to make clear is that scholarship no longer holds the center of my attention, that my life has fallen under the rule of a dark drive, which I'm aware that I merely name by calling it my Judaism. So when Rosenzweig descended within himself, opened up that treasure chest of his soul, right? Digs out the treasures, brings it up, comes up to the light, brings them out, right? What is the treasure that he finds more than anything else, right? It is his Judaism. And what's striking here is, as I said, it's not that he discovers the true Franz, right? The deep secret of his own authenticity in his soul. When he says he discovers his Judaism, he is discovering that which he inherited from others. And he is discovering something that is much, much bigger than him, right? To be a Jew, to inherit being a Jew, right? It means that it is part of you. It is essential to who you are, right? It is something that is uniquely you, but at the same time, it is something so much bigger than you, because you can't be a Jew unless you are part of Judaism, unless you are connected to other Jews. But in that moment, Rosenzweig recognized that the true way in which he exceeds himself, right, is deeply connected to his own Judaism, right? That part of being a Jew means you never quite fit in the box. In fact, Rosenzweig would argue perhaps the very responsibility of being a Jew in this world is that it's your job that when the world tries to put human beings into boxes, the Jew says, no, like, I don't fit in there, right? I answer to a different authority. I answer a different call. And that is what Rosenzweig is discovering in this moment, right? When his worldview collapses, he finds meaning within the very idea of his Jewishness. If we want to use the revelation language we've been talking about, right? After the collapse, when Rosenzweig goes within himself, right, to discover his Judaism is to hear the call of God, right? And in that moment, Rosenzweig answers, as we've been saying, Hineni, right? He hears the call of Judaism. Judaism is calling to him. God is calling to him. He decides to answer it. But what we have to keep in mind is that he doesn't exactly know what that means. He doesn't know what it means to be a Jew or a religious Jew. He even says this at the time. He says, like the first temptation of anybody when they decide to commit to something, when they've had a conversion moment, when they've had a life transformation, is always to dive into the change, like dive right into the deep end, right? When a person becomes a Baal Tshuva, right, often the inclination is they're going to go all the way to the extreme. Rosenzweig is aware that he doesn't really know what it means to be a Jew. And the worst thing you can do is dive right into the deep end, because if you don't know how to swim, that most likely means you're going to drown. So for Rosenzweig, the rest of his life is basically a journey of trying to figure out what it means to be a Jew, right? And what we should understand is for all of us, right, the very journey of being a Jew is often very much tied to trying to understand what exactly does that mean. Because when we're trying to answer the question about what it means to be a Jew, what we are essentially answering is what is it that God wants of us? Because to be a Jew is to be marked by God, to be called by God. And therefore, the answer that we have to address is like, what does that mean? What does God want, right? What does it mean to live that in this world? Rosenzweig goes on to describe here, he says, the man who wrote the Star of Redemption is not even the person that I am, is a very different person from the person who wrote the Hegel and the State, which was his dissertation. Yet when all is said and done, the new book is only a book. Even the Star of Redemption, which represents his transformation, right? Which represents, again, the collapse, right? The revelation, right? Like the moving on now as a response to that, the commitment to that revelatory moment or that realization of being a Jew. Even then, though, like he has to figure out what it means to be a Jew. Rosenzweig writes the Star of Redemption without really fully knowing what it means to living life as a Jew. He actually knows a fair amount about Judaism at that point. He's learned some things, but he doesn't know what it means to live as a Jew. And that's why he's saying even the Star of Redemption is not the most important thing in the world to me, because as I've said before, the verification of the star is going to be living your life, like according to what on some level it is trying to point to. He says this, and so where does that leave him? He says, the small, at times exceedingly small things called by Goethe demands of the day, which is made upon me in my position at Frankfurt. I mean, the nerve-wracking, picayune, and at the same time, very necessary struggles with people and conditions have now become the real core of my existence. And I love this form of existence, despite the inevitable annoyance that goes with it. So what Rosenzweig is describing here is he went from somebody who was on the academic path to becoming a professor to somebody who now runs a Jewish institution, right? You want to use it in contemporary language. He's running a Jewish nonprofit. He's running a GCC. He's running a synagogue, right? And as you can imagine, right, the academic life looks very different than what it means to run an organization for a bunch of Jews. Right? Academic life is built around a certain elitist conception of, the professor is the authority figure, right? The professor is the one who's the expert, who does research, who spends their summers, in the library looking through manuscripts, right? Who has students whose job is just to absorb everything the, professor says, to treat them with great, respect and admiration, right? None of that applies when you are responsible for running an organization for Jews, right? Because when you're running an organization, right, you have to deal with real people. And as much as you might like to think you're supposed to be an authority figure, but you discover very quickly when you run an organization in which Jews are a part of it, that Jews don't necessarily look at their authority figures as authorities, right? That you have to answer to them maybe far more than they have to answer to you. Many people, if they had to choose the life of a professor or the life of running a Jewish institution, like we might say being a rabbi of a synagogue, I think most people, if they looked objectively at what those things look like in practice, they'd say, go be a professor. Rosenzweig is saying, I don't prefer that kind of existence, because the life of a professor would be one of, we might say, pure theory or pure objective knowledge. He might say it's a life of 2 + 2 = 4. But as we said before, those truths are not the higher truths, right? Those are things that, you can figure out relatively easily. Right, the higher truths are those truths that only can be experienced and verified in life. Right, so there's something very profound here, because as a rabbi, a former synagogue rabbi, who spent a lot of time in a lot of meetings on a lot of projects about things that were definitely nerve-wracking and picayune, and I could use a lot more adjectives that might sound inappropriate. Right, what Rosenzweig is saying is, rather than looking at those things as like a pain in the butt, as things that are like a waste of time, what he's arguing is those things are the essence of human existence. They're the building blocks of a real life, right? Because to be in this world means to be in this world in relation to other people and to be responsible to other people. It does not mean being in an ivory tower, giving lectures, demanding people listening to you, and fighting with others about, who's the real expert, right? Rosenzweig would say that's not really a human life. At least not in the sense that in a relationship with God is trying to orient us to, right? And so that even though a real life existence, like running a Jewish institution, means like real Jews and real complaints and real questions and real board meetings and real committee meetings, right? Like that's where life is to be found, because it is being lived, as I said, in relationship with other people and with responsibility towards other people. And he says, I love this. Right, because he knows what the alternative is. The alternative is to live in the world in which you have your ideological worldview and everything has to be put inside of it. Right, you have professors, that's kind of their job. They have their theories. They have their, they're the ones who espouse the worldviews that we, absorb. Right, it's their job to help us put everything in its proper place, to make sense of everything, tell us the difference between good and bad, but to do it from the ivory tower. Right, oftentimes very disconnected from real life. Rosenzweig is saying, if you want to know anything, you got to be in the world. He says, not every question, and by the way, what I should add here is that what he's also acknowledging is that the way in which we turn to the other, right? That like if redemption is supposed to follow revelation, that always means a turn towards the other, towards the neighbor, to the person who's calling my name, to the person beside me who I feel responsible to as a human being, right? And Rosenzweig is noting is that scholars, academics can't really attend to human beings. They can attend to ideas, they can attend to theories, they can attend to social media. They can't really attend to the human being. Right? Rosenzweig actually has this quote in one of his essays where he says that you can always take out like the very essence of an idea or select a few sentences from a book or from a writer, and you basically can reduce them to a caricature, right? Like it's very easy to strip people away, their humanity, to reduce them to a cog in the wheel, right? And a way to reducing them to like a very, one-dimensional kind of existence. And when Rosenzweig says that, I immediately thought of like Twitter, because that's what Twitter does, social media does in general. It reduces people, ideas, and positions to like the most one-dimensional version of themselves as possible. And Rosenzweig knows that's like always the easy way out, because real human beings, flesh and blood human beings, are so much more than that, so much more complicated than that. It's easy to treat human beings like one-dimensional caricatures. We desire to treat human beings like one-dimensional caricatures, but again, an experience in which we hear the call of God and a life that's lived in relationship to that is one in which we no longer can look at human beings that way, because we see that whatever ideological structures we use to simplify the world for us, they just don't hold up. He says, not every question seems to me worth asking. Scientific curiosity and omnivorous aesthetic appetite mean equally little to me today, though I was once under the spell of both, particularly the latter. Now, I only inquire when I find myself inquired of, meaning what he's noting here is no longer is it publish or perish. No longer is it that I have to write and think because I'm being paid and forced to do so. Now I do it because it's like somebody's asking me a question because I'm curious about something. Right? Because there's a movement from the outside, right, that actually inspires me. There's a call from the other that I feel like I need to answer. Inquired of that is by men rather than by scholars. But again, it's about human beings, the encounter with a real flesh and blood human being. On the other hand, the questions asked by human beings have become increasingly important to me. This is precisely what I mean by cognition and knowledge as a service. Not knowledge for knowledge's sake, but knowledge and thinking in service to the call of the other. He says, a readiness to confront such questions, to answer them as best as I can out of my limited knowledge and my even slighter ability, right? That my job as a human being in this world is to be sensitive and aware of those around me so that when they call, like I have a capacity to answer, like to the best that I can, right? Knowing that none of us are ever going to have all the answers. And oftentimes we feel like whatever answers we have are pretty poor and limited. But what matters is that when we hear the call, that we're actually able to turn to the neighbor and answer them, say hineni, as a human being to a human being. And that is something from the position of ideology, from the position of, political, worldviews that one is simply unable, to do, right? And the times of them that are most ideological, I don't have to tell you this, but I'll say it anyway, are the times where we are least able to look at the other as human beings. And I say that being here in Israel, with a war between Israel and Hamas, going on right now, that it could not be clearer to me how, true that is. And that is the danger. And that is what, in a certain sense, life as a Jew is trying to fight against. Right, that to be a Jew on some level means recognizing all human beings are created in the image of God, which if that's true, if we take that seriously, then we just simply cannot look at the world through our ideological, lens. So what I'm trying to show here is how in Rosenzweig's own life, the ideas of death, the ideas of the human being that exceeds all boxes the world puts us into, that the idea of revelation, God's call to us and holding ourselves committed to that call, right? The idea of like turning to the other who is right there, right? And when it's hard and when it's messy, right? When I read Rosenzweig describe this, I always think about my synagogue, board meetings and committee meetings, right? Because if there was a moment that I thought was like the moment that I ever experienced in my life that was like the least redemptive moment possible, it was like a synagogue board meeting. And because it's just, they're so tough for a variety of reasons. And Rosenzweig is saying on a certain level, that is the essence of redemption, because you are sitting there with fellow Jews and it's your job to be responsible again to them, for them, right? To the best that you can, to try to hash out what it means to be a human being in this world together, to be a Jew in this world together. That's the only way life can be, right? And the question is, can we be open to it, or can we try to run away from it? A redeemed life is one that is open to it in its fullness, as difficult and as painful as that might be. Now, if there's, again, not to be too sarcastic, if there's one thing more difficult than a synagogue board meeting, it's finding out that you've been diagnosed with ALS. Again, Rosenzweig already in 21, 22 is discovering that he has this disease. It causes him to have to resign from the Lair House. And if there's anything that is going to test Rosenzweig's thought, right, it's going to be whether or not it can really hold up. It is the experience of this disease and what it does to him. And in many ways, this is like, the moment in which, all of his thought, it kind of like comes to a head here. And what makes Rosenzweig's struggle with his disease so significant, and we saw this, in the very first session with this letter from Hans Tribb. It's a letter written to Martin Buber about having visited Rosenzweig when Rosenzweig was already paralyzed. And what Tribb highlights, first off, he says that his visit to Rosenzweig was like the most impactful moments of that year for him, because to see Rosenzweig in a state of basically complete paralysis, only able to communicate through like eye movement, that there was something about that experience for Tribb that was, as I said before, singular, right? Transcendent, right? It showed Rosenzweig as a human being who was fully self, right? Fully that creation that is in the image of God that cannot be put into a box. That the world says, you are done, Rosenzweig. And yet, nonetheless, Rosenzweig is able to move his eye and communicate to the other in the deepest possible way. And that's essentially what he's reflecting on in this letter. And I'll just read the key line from me. He says, I can see Rosenzweig before me in the flesh, immured in his paralyzed body, the highest measure of disability for a person still to turn toward this world, right? What's so fascinating is that the test of Rosenzweig's thought really is, no matter what, can you still be in this world? Because in truth, there is always an alternative to leave it, right? When we are confronted with the possibility of death, we can decide, or we can either think that it's maybe not so bad because we've got our ideas that are going to let us, live beyond it on some level, right? Or, we can just say, you know what, death is easier than being here, right? And there's not anything, I'm not trying to play this a deep moral judgment on that. What I'm trying to do is do something a little bit different, which is to recognize how profound it is when people decide to stay in this world, when the alternative maybe actually seems easier and better. So again, Rosenzweig, despite basically being taken out of the world completely, paralyzed, it doesn't look like he's living a human existence. He is still able to turn towards the world, towards the other, towards the neighbor. Rosenzweig does not turn away from it. Day by day, he places himself into his suffering and brings us tidings of the impossible life of the human person, right? Because Rosenzweig doesn't give up and he doesn't let himself be taken out of the world. This existence of his, the way he spoke to me, does it not bear witness to the life of man in this world? Does it not show us all how all of us placed into this world and attached to it endure our being sent away from it, right? And what Rosenzweig is basically doing, he knows he's going to die, but for every moment that he has, he wants to be turned towards the world and not away from it. And what Rosenzweig shows in his paralysis is how the impossible is possible when you're a human being created in the image of God, who has experienced, revelation in a sense, that experiences something that far beyond them, that makes them be able to realize that the other beside you contains that, potential as well. And that the only place in which we can find the kind of meaning that we are looking for as human beings is right here, right now, no matter how bad it gets. And what Rosenzweig shows in the course of his illness is that even when it feels like everything is being taken away, there's always something that remains. And this is going to be very important for Rosenzweig. You'll see how it connects to his notion of Jewishness and how that relates to ideas in the Star of Redemption. I'll just give you two examples of that briefly. The first is a letter to his mother in 1925. Again, he's already pretty heavily into his illness. I'm pretty sure he's paralyzed at this point fully. And he is noting that his mother, has a very hard time with Rosenzweig's existence, right? That she feels that he is suffering, and he is suffering in an extreme fashion, right? And this is often the case. People with very chronic, severe, serious illness and disabilities, often people from the outside look at them and think that their life isn't really worth living, right? They think that their life must just be full of like profound suffering and nothing more, right? It's a mistake that we all make, right? We've all had this experience. I mean, my mother's on the line here, right? And Wayne, who I've known my whole life, is also here, right? They both worked in medical professions. In the medical field, in the broadest sense, right? Like you encounter people who you spend some time with them and you think, my God, they'd be better off dead, right? Like you have moments like that in your life, right? My mother worked in nursing homes. Like you have moments like that. It's inescapable. And the challenge is recognizing that as long as there is a human life, right, there is the possibility of meaning, right? Now, it doesn't mean that sometimes there shouldn't be a choice made that it's too much, but we also, again, we can't make the mistake from the outside, judging an individual and assuming that on the inside, it's pure pain and suffering. There's nothing really there. Because when we reach that point, it's really saying something more about our own discomfort than the reality of the other before us. And he actually notes here, right? Like he says, a Homeric God would not be able to imagine human life other than as torment and suffering, right? Homer, the Greeks, right? The depiction of human life is pure tragedy, pure suffering, right? Like there's no endpoint where there's anything ultimately, positive. And it'd be easy to look at someone like Rosenzweig and say, that's all there is, right? Like just end this, right? The people, again, it's not that Rosenzweig's contemplating suicide. To a certain extent, the others around him are saying, wouldn't it be better off if you were dead? And Rosenzweig is doing the impossible. He's saying, no, as long as I got time, I want to be here. He says, you think it's bad, but again, even in the midst of pain and suffering, life is never only that. He says, this is just as wrong as what you say. I suffer when my ear itches at night and I can't scratch myself. But if you wait a bit, it will pass without you. Meaning eventually it stops itching. On such occasions, I sometimes notice the abnormality of my condition, which I often don't think about for days. At night, when I don't sleep, I often think about my life, right? If you're in bed and you're paralyzed and it's night, you can't help but reflect on your existence. But then the last few years have only stood out in the same way that one era stands out from others. Meaning it's not like the years of his illness defines his whole life. That is who he is in his totality. It's one period of his life. Like there have been other periods of his life, which again, the temptation is to say that is everything. It is all pain and suffering. It is all darkness, right? Rosenzweig is saying, no, this doesn't define who I am. I am more than my illness. What one has to think of as suffering from the outside turns out to be a total of great difficulties that have to be overcome. Yes, there's profound suffering, but that doesn't define the sum total of who I am. And there are moments of victory. There are moments of overcoming. There are moments of joy. There are moments of happiness, right? Even amidst suffering and sorrow. It says the comparison you make between being at war and my situation is very fitting. What will be when the means through which I connect to others are no longer there? I do not know. Right? The great fear for Rosenzweig is what happens when I can't communicate at all. What happens when I can't move my eye and at least like spell out words for people? What happens when I'm totally locked in, right? Because in some ways, that's the moment where you might say he's not really in relationship with anybody. So even for him, right, his whole thought is about what does it mean to be in relationship with God and with others? What happens when it seems like that's not possible at all? He says, what will be for me without Edith? That's his wife. I do not dare to think about. Right, when she can no longer help him communicate. She's been the one doing a lot of the facilitation to help him communicate with anybody about anything. My great supporter, that's his wife he's talking about, who turns suffering into difficulties. Meaning Rosenzweig is also pointing out here, this is not a triumph of the spirit in which one person overcomes against all, right? This is not his Jesus moment where everything is redeemed because of him. And I use that Christian language because Trib was also kind of hinting to that kind of Christian language. To the extent that Rosenzweig overcomes his suffering, it is also dependent on others. It is dependent on his wife, her assistance, her love, that is enabling him to not be sucked within the black hole of his pain, at least to get him out of it somewhat, so it can be just difficult, but not, tormentingly painful. And he also talks about the small comforter, which is a reference to his son, who's only a couple years old at this point, that turns that which remains into joy, right? So it is through the relationships with others, right, that it's not pure suffering and terror, right? It's through the relationships with others that there's always something that remains. As long as there's a human life, there's something there. And as he's saying here, like there can be joy, that his son brings him that possibility. And he's noting that this letter was written on the anniversary of his marriage to Edith. It's 5 years later. 5 years ago today, engagement day, wedding day. But the three of us, me and Edith and Raphael, that's his son, praised the day despite everything. Right? Even though he's basically in the worst position a human being could be, right? Like it's his anniversary. It's the day which brings him together with his wife, and it's the day which makes the possibility of his son a reality. And on that day, despite everything that's going on, he still wants to thank God. He still wants to offer praise because there's always that possibility of meaning that remains. That's one letter that I wanted to mention. The other letter, which again, I'll only do briefly because I know we're coming to the end of the time here. This letter is also a letter to Trub 2 years later. And what he's noting again is like what happens, through this sustained experience of illness. Like what is going on here? What does it mean to him? And what he notes is that he's able to do things that are exceptional at times. He is writing through just moving his eye. He writes large amount of essays, even while he can really just move his eye, right? Which is something profound and unbelievable. But he's also able to note that like his life has fundamentally changed through the context of his illness. He notes here, he says, the actual is the third paragraph. The actual great experience that these years have brought me is different. A very negative and positive one as well. There's been a negative change and a positive change in relation to his illness. The radical change in my existence has scared away almost all of my former people, all my former friends. Most of his friends don't want to see him anymore because it's too much for them, right? To see Rosenzweig in this condition, right? This individual who's one of the most brilliant human beings, creative human beings you could ever come across, to see him paralyzed, to see him, as he writes elsewhere, like literally drool, spittle coming out of his mouth because he can't control his muscles, right? For most people, it's just simply too much. And what he notices is that he has this great line. He says, even over human relationships, invisible and unimagined by most, stands the clause that after the Frederick the Great appears in the sympathetic ink in all interstate treaties. What he's noting here is that Frederick the Great instituted like this thing basically on certain international treaties, that these things work except in war, right? There's always moments in which the treaty can become undone. And what Rosenzweig is noting is that we have these relationships with others that we think are like unconditional. And then the moment comes in which there's that radical change, like we get super ill with this disease that's like horrible and unimaginable. And suddenly that relationship that we thought was unconditional, the contract that it was written on gets torn up because it had a clause that said, okay, we'll be with you, we'll be your friend, we'll love you, ad can, up until here. But once you go beyond some of those, beyond that line, we're out of here. Which is not an easy thing. And Rosenzweig himself notes that the very idea that we should think that our lives should have this total continuity, that all our friends that we had 20 years ago are going to be with us 20 years in the future, that's kind of a miracle. That doesn't really happen. And the challenge of this illness is how much it takes away, right? How many of his friends it's taken away, how much of his life it's taken away. But he also says that there's something positive as well. He says the positive aspect is as follows. Just as early acquaintances abandon a person, so too new people seek to become close to them. These people from the beginning accept the new situation of one with the illness. Meaning I've lost a lot of friends, but I've also gained friends. And the friends that I've gained, they accept me with my illness because they've only known me with the illness. He says, in theory, they know obviously that the person's situation was once different. They know I wasn't always paralyzed in bed, barely able to move. But in practice, on an emotional level, they do not know exactly that the situation was different. They really only know me as I am now. So they're able to accept who I am now. They're able to live with you in the new situation, just as others were able to live with you only in the previous situation. And so life is not made any more depleted, right? That's the key point here, right? The illness takes things away, but as long as there's life, there's always something that remains, right? He's lost friends, but he's also held on to some and gained new ones, right? To be human means that no matter what horrifying, terrible experience that you have in this world, it cannot take everything away from you, right? That as long as there is life, there is that which remains. And that even when it feels like everything's being taken away, right? Being a Jew means recognizing that there's always something that there remains. The very essence of being a Jew is that when everything is taken away from us, like we're still here. He says, and so life is not made any more depleted. This is my most impressive experience. As much is taken from you, so much is given to you, right? In other words, as much is taken away, there's always that which remains. And this is not a rule you can expect in advance. This is the problem, right? You cannot go into something saying, okay, after the loss, there'll still be that which remains. Like, we don't experience the world that way as human beings. Loss is loss. Loss is horrible, painful. We never can, look into it and say, okay, this is going to be okay. I can't see a loved one in the hospital about to die and be able to say, well, it'll be okay afterwards, right? There'll still be something. My life will still be meaningful. There'll still be some aspect about this person that continues to be a presence in my life, right? You can't think that, because all you can think about is that you're going to lose that which matters most to you. He says it does not release one's heart from fear and hope, even though there will be that which remains. But once you've experienced it afterwards, it is an endless consolation and an inexhaustible reason for gratitude, right? You saw this before in the previous letter, right? As long as he's got his wife, as long as he's got his son, right? Like life has meaning, and that meaning is worth being grateful for. It brings a measure of consolation even amidst the pain, right? Because something remains. And that takes us to the philosophical point I want to make. When Rosenzweig has this crisis and he thinks he's going to convert to Christianity, he ends up finally coming to the realization that he wants to remain a Jew. And he writes this in a letter to his cousin, Rudy Ehrenberg. Ehrenberg himself had been a Jew who converted to Christianity. He was there when Rosenzweig made the decision to convert to Christianity. And he's now hearing from his cousin, who was like one of his best friends as well, that Rosenzweig says, I must tell you something that will grieve you and made first appear incomprehensible to you after prolonged, I believe, thorough self-examination. I have reversed my decision. It no longer seems necessary to me, and therefore, being what I am, no longer possible. I will remain a Jew. And the reason this point is profound and philosophical is Rosenzweig is essentially saying to Ehrenberg, and says it to Rosenstock as well, you made good points when you pointed out how meaningless my life as a Jew is. And you made good points when you showed how a Christian life can be a meaningful life in this world. But you know what? I went to the ends of the earth. Like, I felt my world collapse. And at the end of the day, what was left remaining for me was the inescapable fact for Rosenzweig that, as he says, I'm a Jew, right? When he dove deep inside of himself, and he opened up that treasure chest, what did he come out with, right? Like, as he said, is Judaism, right? Like, there's something about his life as a Jew that remains no matter what, even if it doesn't make sense to him or to others, right? That there's still a sense that he is called by it. And as long as he is called by it, he will continue to answer. In the Star of Redemption, towards the end, he ties this towards the very essence of being a Jew. That being a Jew means that we keep, like I keep saying, hanging around, right? Like, even when it doesn't make sense, right? Even when it would be much easier to say, I don't need to be a Jew anymore, right? There's no good that comes from that. It doesn't make sense. Why should I believe in God? This Torah thing doesn't really provide meaning for me in the way that it should, right? Like, there's a moment where you can so easily say again and again and again, like, I don't want to be a Jew, right? But being a Jew means holding on to it no matter what. He says, from Israel to the Messiah, from the people that stood under Sinai to the day when the house in Jerusalem will be called a house of prayer for all peoples, from Sinai to redemption, there leads a concept that appeared in the prophets and since then has governed our internal history, the idea of the remnant, right? The remainder, right? This is an idea that appears in Yeshayahu, the Jewish people. The fact that Jewish people persist throughout history is this notion that there always is a remainder of Jews, right? No matter what you do, right, there are still some Jews, right? That's certainly part of the message of Jewish history, right? Hitler was gosh darn successful, but as successful as he was, there were still some Jews left over, right? The remnants of Israel, those who have remained faithful, the true people and the people, they are at every moment the guarantee that a bridge leads between these two poles. Right, the very fact that there can be any continuity between Sinai and the Mashiach, between revelation and redemption, is the fact that there are remnants of Jews that persist, right, that hold the line between those two moments. He says, the Messiah comes today, the remnant is ready to receive him, right? To be The remainder, the Jew who remains, means that you carry revelation, but you are looking forward to redemption, right? You are caught between those moments, right? Jewish history is in defiance of all world history of the remnant, concerning which the world of the prophet is always current, that it will remain, right? The Jew is just, they're still here, right? All the different iterations of what that means to be a Jew. All worldly history is about expansion. He's referring here primarily to Christianity. Christianity, world history, the last 2,000 years is about the gospel, right? Converting more and more of humanity, right? Christianity is built on a sense of expansion, right? Everything, more and more, the world becomes, essentially Christian. Power is therefore the fundamental concept of history. So you can expand through power, right? Most of Christian expansion was, death or converts in a certain sense. Because in Christianity, revelation has begun to spread over the world, and so all will for expansion. Even the consciously and only purely worldly expansion has become the unconscious servant of this great moment of expansion. Judaism and nothing else in the world preserves itself by subtraction, by a narrowing, by formation of new remnants. Right? Christianity is all about more and more Christians. And the strange way what Rosenzweig is saying is the fact that Judaism preserves itself is not by necessarily making more Jews, right? Like the way Judaism preserves itself is that there's always some Jews holding on no matter what, right? It's that persistent clinging to Jewishness that ensures the continuity of Jews, not Jewish babies. I mean, Jewish babies are part of the story, but they're not the final answer to it, right? It's that the fact that when people, again, are faced with a choice, as Rosenzweig was, right? Whether or not you're going to be a Jew, and the logical answer, the moral answer is don't be a Jew anymore, right? Rosenzweig's point is that there's always a remnant, there's always a remainder that says, no matter what, this is who we are. We can't escape it. And Rosenzweig concludes, he says, and he is so, the man in Judaism is always somehow a remnant. It's always to be a remainder. It's always to never quite fit in, right? The world has its boxes and the Jews don't fit in the box, right? That's the story of the Jewish people historically, certainly the story of the Jewish people right now, right? He is always somehow one who remains, an inside whose outside was seized by the river of the world and driven off, whilst he himself, that which remains of him, remains standing on the shore, right? The metaphor that Rosenzweig gives here is you can imagine a moment in which there's the river of time, everything is being carried forth with it, history proceeds, right? Like the Jew sort of steps into the river, but the Jew somehow also just remains on the shore, right? There's so much of Judaism that just gets sloughed off in history, but there's always this element of Jewishness that just remains, right? Even though there is so much of us that is not Jewish. This is kind of his point. He's a German Jew. He's practically Christian, right? And that he's secular, right? That applies to all of us. There's so much of us that is not Jewish, right? At the end of the day. But what makes us a Jew is that Jewish part that clings to Jewishness, even when those other pieces just kind of fall away. He says there is something waiting in him, and he has something in him. He may call it by different names, what he is waiting for and what he has, often scarcely able to name them. But there is a feeling in him as if both, that having and the waiting are joined most profoundly together. And this is precisely the feeling of the remnant, which has revelation and awaits salvation, right? To be the remainder, be the Jew who remains, is that when even everything is taken away, you've got two things, right? As a Jew, you've got revelation, you've got God's call. You can't escape that. And that call ultimately orients you towards redemption, right? That possibility that everything will change, that possibility that human beings will actually turn towards each other in love and not in hate, right? That orients us even when everything else has been taken away. For Rosenzweig, again, there's so much of his thought that I find interesting and profound. And even in our learning about this, we're barely fully capturing all the dimensions of it. But I guess I'll end. I just closed my slide, but I'll end with just the words of the end of the Star of Redemption. As I said, the book begins with death and it shifts at the end towards life. Rosenzweig ends the book by citing the famous verse from Micha, from the prophet Micha. He says, and to walk in the light of the divine countenance is granted only to him who follows the words of the divine mouth. Right? If you want to walk in God's light, if you want to walk in God's face, you got to follow these words from the prophet Micha. For he has told thee, oh man, what is good? And what does the Lord thy God require of you? Right? That's what the prophet asked. What does God want of you? Right? That's the ultimate question. Ultimate question of being a Jew. Right? Micha answers it. What God wants of you as follows: to do justice and to love mercy and to walk humbly with God. Right? And Rosenzweig concludes the star as follows. He says, to walk humbly with thy God, the words are written over the gate which leads out of the mysterious, miraculous light of the divine sanctuary, in which no man can remain alive. Meaning, to experience revelation is in some way to be taken out of the world, right? Because you see the world from a totally different angle. But again, to live life as a Jew, to move beyond revelation towards redemption, means not just being with God, but walking through that gate back into the world again. And Rosenzweig is saying, above that gate that you have to walk to be in this world as a Jew, are the words to walk humbly with God. Whither then do the wings of the gate open? Like, where does this gate go to? Like, where is the destination here? He says, do you not know? It goes into life. Because that's the only world we got. So I'll end with that. And, if there's a couple, I know we're several minutes past time, but I wanted to just try to bring it together. I'm happy to stay for a few minutes. If people got to go, that's fine too.
I want to make sure you saw that nice comment in the chat, Rabbi Truboff.
Oh, I didn't see it. Sorry.
Yeah, there's a comment for you.
Oh, okay, great.
And
I
Justin,
have sometimes hard time following the chat this session.
yeah, no worries.
Good.
Justin, do you have a comment or a question? No.
One or two. So this is very good. This is really excellent. And I pulled my copy of Star of Redemption, the older version, off the shelf through this, and I've been reviewing it. It seems like in a very short period of time, Rosenzweig assimilated a lot of classic Jewish learning. How do you do that?
So it's a good question. And it's always a bit of a difficult to assess how much he knows and doesn't know. In 1913, after he goes through the crisis and decides to remain a Jew, 1314, he studies with Hermann Cohen in Berlin. Hermann Cohen, great Jewish philosopher. He learns a lot of, at that point, Cohen is not teaching philosophy with them. It's an institute that is not technically an academic institute so much, in which he's teaching Torah, actually. So he learns Tanakh with Cohen, he learns rabbinic texts with Cohen. That's pretty important for him in terms of like getting a foundation. In 1918, 1919, he studies with Nehemiah Nobel, Orthodox rabbi, studies Talmud, studies Halacha, not super great depth. The other advantage that Rosenzweig has is that he has sort of mastered the tradition of German idealism. And there are many conceptual pieces of German idealism that actually, I would say, intuitively match many ideas in rabbinic texts and in Kabbalah. So, like, in many ways, his academic background actually helped him then sort of speed up his Jewish learning, if that makes sense. And it helped him speed up his ability to grasp insights within Jewish rabbinic texts that other people could spend years learning and not see. But in general, it's always a question how much he really, really knows Jewishly. My sense is that he knows, he knows the Bible really well, and he knows a lot of rabbinic texts. He doesn't know halacha so well. He doesn't know Kabbalah so well, but that's not a problem because German idealism kind of covers that in a certain sense. So he's pretty learned at the end of the day. And that doesn't mean he knows everything as well as every rabbi, but you shouldn't ever discount how much he knows Jewishly, is my opinion. Even when he doesn't know things, he's already intuited sort of, pathways of thinking that, exist in the tradition. I can get many examples of that.
Okay. I just think through all of this that the situations that we're confronted with now where, the Jewish people get murdered, we kill back, and we're in this froth that seems untenable. And I'm just not sure how philosophy is going to work its way through the situations that we're presented with. I mean, obviously, especially in the times immediately after Rosenzweig, the world was presented with all of this. But it just seems like, we're inured to, applying any of this and how any part of this will break through into these situations seems, a complete conundrum.
So here's what I'll say. I mean, that's always the most important question. Rosenzweig had a deep frustration with Orthodoxy, Reform, and Zionism, and philosophy. But I'll focus on Orthodoxy, Reform, and Zionism for a moment. The problem with those three movements is that they attempt to put the Jewish people in the box, right? Orthodoxy puts the Jewish people in sort of this reified, ossified box of tradition that's dependent on authority, right? Submission to certain rabbis and a particular perspective on Jewish law and conformity, right? And separating, who are the good Jews and who are not the good Jews, right? Reform wants to put Judaism in the box of what we might call secular liberal humanism, right? Like that what you discover in the Torah is the human being, right, and human values as understood in 19th and early 20th century humanistic European sensibility, right, which means that you don't really discover in Judaism anything that you can't find already in European or modern humanistic culture, right? And then what Zionism wants to do is say the Jewish people are a nation like everybody else, right? That we have a land, we have a language, right? We have a culture that binds us together, right? And like we are a nation, right? And that's how you make sense of us. And what Jewish history has shown again and again and again is that you can't put Jewish people in a box, right? We are not Orthodox, we are not Reform, and we are not truly Zionist, or cannot be reduced to Zionism in the way that it is typically understood, right? What this moment shows us and what Jewish history continuously shows us is just how true that fundamentally is, that we are a remainder, which means in many ways we are also an enigma. For Rosenzweig, recognizing that means that we are also always a provocation, because on some level we have to be able to say to everybody, we are not those things. And everybody most of the world, the people who embody those things don't want to hear that. They want us in the box, and they want us to shut our, and if we're not willing to follow that definition, right, bad things, happen. At the end of the day, what Rosenzweig is also deeply aware of is that none of us is Mashiach, right? So that what we do often has very little impact on the grand issues of the world, which is in some ways is the hardest part about being a modern human being. Because being a modern human being, it means that we think we are powerful and free, and that we should be able to change things for the better for everybody, when in fact we are small, right? And we often have very little influence beyond even our closest circle, right? I can't get my kids to do the things I want, right? And suddenly I'm supposed to change the world, right? The challenge that Rosenzweig is saying is at the end of the day, not that we shouldn't be committed to political action or big ideas, but what matters is the call of the neighbor, right? Whoever that might be. And that's hard, not because, it's hard for a lot of reasons, but it's often hard for us because we want to be able to think in grand terms. We want to be able to think in terms of, okay, this is the solution that's going to solve the problems. But, the life of being a Jew sometimes means recognizing that it's not our job as Jews to answer those big questions. It's our job to be here. It's our job to be responsible to those, around us, and to recognize that when people come to try to put us in boxes, it's our job to say no, right? Sometimes that in itself, right, there's something miraculous about that. For Rosenzweig, the shift from academia to running the Lehrhaus, right, to really being in this world, right, not a perfect world, not a redeemed world, but it was still in a certain sense redemptive because it puts him into relationship and responsibility with others, right? Sometimes that is the greatest thing we can ever ask for, is to be in that position, to feel that responsibility, to be able to hear the call, and to be able on some level to try to answer it, whatever that looks like. It's not going to change the world, but there still can be something redemptive about that, right? And to be able to persist and say, even when the world stops making sense, right, there's still meaning, right? As long as you're a Jew, you feel committed to that, there is still something meaningful, right, to human existence. And we hold to that, even when it doesn't make sense, right? It's not easy. But, whoever said being a Jew was supposed to be.
No, certainly not.
So in a certain sense, Rosenzweig, as much as he spends all this time philosophizing about the biggest questions, at the end of the day, he kind of asks us to realize that sometimes what matters most are the smallest. Like, what do I do with myself today? Like, who is my neighbor, right? Like, especially in moments like ours, like it's important to, I think, sometimes to be able to shift our perspective to those things too.
No, absolutely.
That's not meant to be a cop-out. It's meant to be like an admission of our own powerlessness, on a sense, right? Like,
no, I think you addressed it very, very well.
All right. right. Well, let me wish everybody a and I'll mention this too even with Hanukkah. I mean, I was going to throw this in there, right? Like Hanukkah is a story that when it seems like the Jewish people have been oppressed, they've suffered, the temple's been impurified, right? Like Jewish life is never going to be what it once was. People have converted out, people have assimilated, right? There's a moment in which there is some sort of victory, but more importantly, when the Hashmonaim, the Maccabees, enter into the temple and they find it defiled, they find it full of idols, you might think there's no hope. Like, what do they also find? There's still one little jar of oil left, right? Because there's always something that remains. And I think that's, we have to hold on to that as Jews, that the commitment to the belief that even when a lot gets taken away and a lot doesn't make sense, right? There's always something that remains. There's always something that still calls to us from the past and from the future. Like to be a Jew means, as I said, to be caught between revelation and redemption, and to know that like, that's where you are. That's where you're always going to locate yourself.
Okay.
Thank you, Evie, for letting us go over a little bit. And I wish everybody well, and God willing, there'll be future classes at Drisha. I'm happy to, do more teaching again too.
I hope so. Thank you so much, Rabbi Truboff. I'll definitely miss this class on next Thursday. And thank you so much to everyone who joined us today and always. Just a few announcements before we close the Zoom. There's 2 new classes that have started, and it's not too late to sign up. Hanukkah, holiday of homebodies, on Tuesdays at 8 p.m. with Rabbanit Leah Sarna, and also technologies of transmission on Wednesdays at 8 p.m. with Rabbanit Sarah Wochenfeld. And please also join us for Nature and the Supernatural in Medieval Ashkenaz, the Renee and Alexander Bohm Memorial Lecture with Dr. David Shayovitz, I think.
Shayovitz, yeah.
Shayovitz. It's meeting this Sunday, December 3rd at 7 p.m. on Zoom and also on Facebook Live. Registration is also open for winter Zman classes with a special short program on organ donation from December 25th to the 27th, and the continuation of Mishnah in depth on Ketubot with Rabbanit Leah Sarna. You can find out all this information and also sign up for those classes at 5784.risha.org/winter. Thank you again, Rabbi Truboff.
Right, the other thing I'll say is if I whet your appetite for Rosenzweig, I have about 15 plus shiurim on YouTube. Some of it's like things we did, a lot of it isn't. So you can always Google my name there. And there's a whole bunch more shiurim on Rosenzweig to be found there.
Perfect.
And I'm hoping to write a book that in a few years, I'm allowed this too, that God willing, I'll finish at some point.
Okay, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Lehitraot.